Hello again, this is Preheat. Welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So apologies in advance for my setup not being as crisp as normal. I'm actually traveling for the holidays, but today we have something really exciting to share with you. So we're going to be looking at a sneak peek of the new hero talents coming in The War Within, the new World of Warcraft expansion. So there are 3 different hero talent specializations for Evoker, but you only have access to 2 of them at a time for any given specialization. So what we're going to be discussing today is the Chrono Warden specialization. This is the one that's available to Augmentation Evokers and Preservation Evokers. For this reveal, I was able to partner up with Jericho, the Augmentation Evoker guide writer for Wowhead.
Thanks, Preheat. My name's Jericho. I'm the augmentation guide writer over at Wowhead. These days I main and make content for DPS Evoker, so augmentation and devastation. I raid in a little guild called Euphoric over in the NA servers. Honestly, it's my first time doing one of these, so I'm a little nervous, guys, but I'm super excited to be here, so thanks for having me.
We interviewed George Velev, game producer for World of Warcraft.
My name is George Velev. Like you mentioned, I'm a game producer on the World of Warcraft team, working with the combat design team.
And Jade Martin, lead combat designer.
Yeah, hey everyone. Happy to be here to talk about hero talents. As mentioned, Jade Martin, one of the lead combat designers on WoW. I've been over here on WoW for almost 5 years now.
And we were able to get 30 minutes with them to pick their minds about what they were going for on these talents and ask very specific, detailed questions about them. I'm really excited to share the answers with you. We are very excited for these talents, and we're going to be weaving in those questions and answers as we go over the individual talents. But I want to start by explaining what hero talents are. So hero talents are the new progression system for leveling in The War Within. We're going to be leveling up to level 80, which means we have 10 levels. You start with 1 talent and then you get an additional 10, which means in the end you will have 11 talents to put into the hero talent tree of your choosing. Hero talents, quote, build on the abilities and talents of current classes and specializations. They can sometimes include new abilities, but they don't necessarily have to. So as you can see here, we have 14 nodes in total with 3 choice nodes, and that is how we end up with 11. We're going to talk about each of these individual abilities in just a bit, but let's start with some general information from our interview. First off, thank you for the opportunity and privilege to have the sneak peek and to see these new hero talents coming in The War Within. So loving the different themes and rotations that are going to come from these choices. We have a lot of questions for you. So if you don't mind, we're just going to jump right into it. Loving the columns and the flavor and the fantasy that you can see with each of these different, subcategories that we have on the hero talents. These are awesome ideas. Very excited for this system. So maintaining the freedom to choose new hero talents, each with their own visual gameplay differences, is a great goal. In the blog post, you mentioned wanting options that feel similarly effective, regardless of the content, while avoiding required talents. You acknowledge that throughput is a very important thing for a lot of players. And keeping hero talents in balance is going to be one of your close priorities. I think I speak for a lot of players when I say that ultimately the success of the system will depend on the effort put into tuning. Obviously, they're not all going to be completely tuned in line, but to see this play out as advertised, it's ambitious. So let's start with some general questions about Chrono Warden.
My first question really is the big elephant in the room general question, which is to say I'm thrilled about the idea of this feature and all the flavor that it brings. And the new blog post that's accompanying this does a great job at explaining all the thought process and design. So that's awesome. For me, the obvious first comparison to this system is the Shadowlands Covenants, of course, which saw a lot of iteration over the course of that expansion. I was someone who struggled a little bit with being able to choose between my favorite fantasy and the one that does the biggest numbers. So really, for you guys, how big of a priority is the balance tuning at the end of the day? And what sort of lessons did you guys learn from some of those past expansions? And what does that mean going forward?
Great question. Let's start with lessons learned. Looking at past systems, one of the largest problems with covenants is there was a disparity between class or spec fantasy and the power that was available, right? And that made it really hard to choose because you were, as you mentioned, you're kind of deciding, do I really want to align with what fantasy speaks to me the most, or do I want to do what apparently the best throughput, right? Damage throughput, healing throughput, whatever it might be. Going into the War Within and hero talent trees, the biggest thing we're doing is removing all of that friction. Really, this is a system that you're going to learn as you level up. You're going to be able to put points into all of your hero talent spec trees with only 1 active at a time, right? So you'll at 71, starting at level 71, you'll unlock 1 point, and all the way to 80, you'll have all 11 nodes filled out, right? You get your first one for free, which is why it's 11. You'll be able to change the choice nodes within the tree at any time. And if for whatever reason you don't feel like playing Chrono Warden and you want to play Scale Commander, you can just switch. Removing a lot of the friction is probably the biggest point the biggest thing we learned, right? Is like let's make sure that people can play what they want when they want, and I think that's going to show through with this system. Going back to the harder problem, which is the balance, we're setting up a roll of guidelines for ourselves to really try and hone this in to the best capabilities that we can, where you're going to see a similar amount of single target or AoE nodes between, assuming a DPS tree, right? Similar DPS nodes, whether it's single target or AoE. In terms of utility and defensives, those are also going to be similar, right? Like you're not going to see Scale Commander with 5 utility nodes and Chrono Warden with only 1 utility, right? Because that's obviously creating an imbalance and might be too good in PvP versus PvE. Why would I ever play Chrono Warden if Scale Commander's giving me all this extra utility, right? We're trying to limit that so it doesn't feel. Really, you're picking based off of the fantasy and also how that fantasy is delivered, right? Like that's the big differentiation there, right? Is like maybe one is just they get all their throughput from execute type damage, whereas the other one maybe gets all of their damage from a really sustained damage profile. But at the end, the total package should roughly be the same, and that's really what we're trying to aim and hit.
Also wanted to add real quick that these aren't traditional class talents. You're getting everything in this hero talent tree, which gives us a lot of tools and understanding of like, all right, cool, we know the Mountain Thane package is XYZ. Let's compare that against, Slayer or Colossus and make sure that they're on the same page. The understanding that the player will have everything, give or take a few choice nodes, really goes a long way.
So each column, since we're on the topic, they all have their own theme. There's obviously like sub specs you can have. So we've got like Warp, we've got Temporal Burst, Reverberation for Chrono Warden. So we will get into each one of these a little bit, but which is your favorite? And were there any talents that drew inspiration from maybe some early concepts or ideas for Evoker that didn't quite make it into the game?
Yeah, I like Warp. I think Warp is sick. It's certainly one of the more gameplay impacting talents in the Chrono Warden tree, simply because it is, fundamentally movement in a blink. It also is one of those where like, all right, cool, you're playing with Chrono Warden, you see them warp, and you immediately know that it's a Chrono Warden. And I think that's sort of a great selling point for the hero talent tree. It's also one of the most important ones that we get it right because it is such a big part of the feel of Chrono Warden. In terms of what we're pulling from, yeah, like Reverberations pulled from, I think, a previous Preservation set bonus. Temporal Burst is something we always really wanted to do. Something makes you feel like you're controlling time and manipulating your cooldowns. We did something similar with Flow State and Time Skip. And this felt like a really sort of good and fun angle for the Chrono Warden to pursue. So those are a few things that inspired us.
Is the idea that these talents should fundamentally alter your rotation, or I guess like what are your thoughts on how they will impact the actual gameplay?
Broadly speaking, the goal of the talents really, they should feel impactful, but we don't want to add too much complexity, right? We don't want to inject a lot of complexity that's going to complicate your rotation, make things more difficult, maybe even inject a playstyle that you're not really looking forward to, right? Like they should be impactful. You should be excited when you're playing Chrono Warden and you're doing the things that the Chrono Warden can do. So it's a really fine line for us to walk and how much complexity is there. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we're actually opening up this feedback loop pretty early on Hero Talents is because from the community, we actually want to know, like, are the notes in which we're hitting right now with the complexity that we have too much, too little? We want to be relatively cautious, right? Because at a base level, we want your core and your core spec and class to play as you would expect, right? Like you are still an augmentation evoker. But Chrono Warden is just injecting a little bit of gameplay into your spec, and so hopefully that's coming through, and that's really kind of our goal there.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely like a lot of variety. Well, we have another question later that kind of ties into this, but depending on which you play, obviously because Preservation, Augmentation, very different play styles. But yeah, we can definitely tell that there's some intricacies there that are interesting.
Just to add on to that too is like, I mean, there are 39 of these and all of them are going to have a little bit of different complexity. So some might be a little bit simpler and some a little bit more complex than others. But I mean, it's definitely going to be a range and a scope of complexity as we go through these 39 different hero talent trees.
So I really like the answers about how they're going to emphasize the balance on these trees. Obviously, we have to wait and see what happens, but so far so good. Now, when it comes to the actual identity of Chrono Warden, as mentioned, Warp is a big part of that, right? And this is a really cool talent because it makes it so that your hover is basically a blink. So what does that mean? Well, I asked a little bit about this talent. Warp talents, they're awesome. I'm a mage veteran, so the idea of having a blink as an evoker really excites me a lot. So does warp mean that I can teleport over hazards like blink? And what happens if I do it in a neutral position? Because right now you can hover neutral and you just like stay put. So is that still going to fling me forward, or am I just going to blink in place?
Yeah, kind of topical. We were actually discussing this last week after playtesting with warp, and yeah. So to like the easy answer, yeah, it's similar to blink. It does allow you to avoid dangerous hazards like fire on the ground. So as a veteran mage, as you said, it should feel pretty familiar. The difference here actually is we were actually discussing letting you to warp in place with it. We don't know what that looks like yet because it's kind of a little bit of a new concept, but it is something I think we want to add because it does, it keeps that hover theme of being able to hover in place, and that feels pretty integral to how we would expect warp to work.
I think one of the best features about blink is if you're in the air, usually it will teleport you onto the ground. So like a neutral, and this is something that like annoys me with hover, just like as a side thing. Whenever you hover in the air, you get flung forward regardless of your input. Whereas with this talent, like I could see it, bringing you down to earth, which would actually be fantastic. That's exactly what I would want. So do with that what you will. Talk about this warp a little bit more. I was just thinking, so is it also a way maybe to break out of roots? Like, could you use warp to teleport if you're rooted, or would that, theoretically come along with you?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer offhand right now how it functions, but that's something we could probably figure out really
Write it
closely.
down. Write it down.
That would be sick on Mythic Tendril.
Yes.
I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm doing that right now.
Yeah.
That's why it came to mind. I'm like,
Yeah,
oh my gosh.
Me too. I was like, oh, that
At
sounds
the-
really cool, actually. I'm gonna write that
At
down.
the moment, I don't think it does, but I mean but again, those are things like getting this out there early, something we can talk about as a team and see if that's something we could apply to the talent itself.
I know for like the PvPers out there, apparently roots are like the big thing that they're all really upset about when it comes to playing Evoker. So just a thought. I absolutely love how excited everyone got whenever we were having this conversation about warp. And I think it really says a lot about how cool this ability is going to be. Moving down that side of the tree, we now have a choice node between interdimensional phase and modes of acceleration. So to me, this choice is pretty obvious, right? Warp reduces damage taken by 30%, starting high, reducing over 2 seconds. That sounds insane. I'm going to take this talent in pretty much every case. So I asked him, how do you balance this talent and how do you balance this with Devastation's options? Because, they don't have access to this talent, and this is a lot of damage mitigation. So I asked for some clarity. In the blog post, it mentioned that some talents are going to be adjusted depending on which spec you're playing. So I think the example was like tank versus DPS for warrior. So are there also going to be differences when it comes to the difference in the talent between DPS specs? So for instance, Augmentation is obviously very tanky, right? They have the cheat death and all their cooldowns last longer for defensives. And now they have access to a really short cooldown, 30% damage reduction that Devastation can't. So are there considerations for this kind of thing to try and, I guess, equal out some of the power?
Yeah, definitely a good question. I mean, obviously Chrono Warden, is augmentation and preservation, but even there, like I think you're calling out interdimensional phase, if I'm not mistaken, with
Yes.
the warp grants
That's
DR.
the one.
And so that value even might be different between preservation and augmentation. And I think that in terms of like overall power, like you'll see similar type nodes for a devastation node that also maybe grams some sort of DR. But like it's totally possible that 30% DR on warp is just too high for augmentation, considering how survivable they already are, and maybe 15% makes more sense, right? So these are definitely things we're cognizant of. I think one important note here is like these are very early trees. We tried to get the numbers somewhat sane for our internal play testing, but these are all bound to change, especially over the iteration cycle.
Kind of something that we saw in live right now, actually, with the stamina and leech nodes for devastation, right? So you're saying this is it's still on the table even for these.
Absolutely, 100%.
So yeah, I doubt 30% makes it to live. But moving down the tree, we now have a choice node between having 10% more int and stamina, but 10% longer cooldown, versus having an ability where every single time we use a 45-second or longer cooldown, we get a buff, and that's going to last for 15 seconds. And it's also going to make it so that our essence spells extend this buff. Now, we asked a question about the time convergence choice node here. We asked if it would stack duration if you did 2 abilities right after the other, because in most cases, you're going to use your long cooldowns back to back, right? And basically the answer we got was, well, would it make more sense if it worked that way? Because if so, then yes, it should. Essentially, the idea is they don't want to cause unnecessary friction in the abilities. They don't want to have you waiting on your cooldowns unnaturally because you have this hero talent. That's not what they're meant to be doing. So I really got the sense that this is more so about supplementing your current toolkit and not really adding unnecessary friction when it comes to how you might have to change your rotation to make sure that you're min-maxing this buff. So going back to the top of the second row here, we have Temporal Burst, and this actually amplifies our Tip the Scales, and it gives us a nice little haste buff, movement speed, cooldown reduction rate that's going to stack over time. Just for reference, 2 to 40% over 20 seconds is probably going to be on average about 4.2 seconds off of your cooldowns. So Tip the Scales felt pretty underwhelming before. It's really cool to see it get some love here. Definitely excited for that. So will Threads of Fate use targeting priority currently that we have like with augmentation spells? And if so, what lessons from augmentation over the course of Dragonflight did we learn that are going to carry over to these sorts of mechanics? Are there improvements in mind for how it does this priority?
At this point, no. It's not going to use augmentation targeting. It's going to be auto-targeted to allies preferring DPS roles. For preservation in particular, we really didn't want the targeting to feel like you had to focus your healing spells just to buff your damage healers. So right now we want it to be more automatic. But if it feels like it needs to be more targeted, that's good feedback that we can sort of take back and discuss.
Moving down the tree, we have Threads of Fate, which makes it so that during that buff, whenever we cast an Essence ability, we're going to give allies a Thread of Fate buff for 15 seconds. This is basically just Fate Mirror. It's going to give our allies a chance to deal an echo of their damage, dealing 15% of the amount again. Moving down from there, we have Master of Destiny, and this is a choice node with Golden Opportunity. The idea here is you can either pick one where your Empower spells amplify all of your active Threads of Fate throughout, increasing their power by 100% for 8 seconds, stacking twice. We asked for clarity on this talent if it would work retroactively. So if you already had a bunch of buffs out and then you use your Empowers, obviously it would buff those. But if you did any more buffs, if you had any new Threads of Fate with this buff out, it actually is supposed to buff those, at least for right now. Going down to Golden Opportunity, this is either a Prescience cooldown reset or it's Echo not costing Essence. Now, obviously, these are both very support themed. So I was kind of curious to know if the idea here is that the hero talent should kind of bridge the gap and create new support roles for Preservation, perhaps even Devastation. So let's listen on that. With the addition of Augmentation, we've seen just how hard it can be to balance things between specs when one of them is a support, just like a Devastation 10.2. Are hero talents meant to kind of help bridge the gap between Augmentation and its peers by adding more support maybe to Preservation and Devastation and other trees we maybe haven't seen yet? Is that kind of the intent, or are these kind of like a different idea?
It's really quite a different idea. I mean, they're really here to primarily add new gameplay opportunities to specs. I think with Augmentation, it's really fun and interesting that we can let Devastation and Preservation dip into support playstyles. But the goal of these talents is, and basically gameplay, is to give them flavor and some gameplay around support, but not sort of the main focus of it. Regarding Chrono Warden, the support-oriented talents are throughput-oriented. They're not things that focus on large utility or defensive buffs. And considering that they are throughput-oriented, that's part of the budget and the tuning package of Chrono Warden. So we're not really aiming for these to be mandatory. If anything, those support bonuses will be part of the bucket that Chrono Warden tuning contains.
To jump on that, is that maybe a hint that Scale Commander might see a little more on the group utility side and sort of tankular support, or are we still trying to keep things kind of one-to-one in terms of throughput to throughput kind of thing?
We're keeping things one-to-one for now. We are experimenting with Chrono Warden and Scale Commander having, both of them share augmentation, so both of them will have some support themed talents. That being said, we want to make sure they're not required picks because, as you mentioned, it can cause problems. That might mean that some of these support-oriented talents are things like fixed damage, like Inferno's Blessing. But we're sort of feeling that and seeing what feels right and appropriate.
Great.
Excellent. Well, that was my next question. So I'll still ask it. You just gave the answer, but so Chrono Wardens obviously has a lot of crossover to Augmentation support theme. We can feel that throughout the hero talents that are adjacent to Augmentation. So obviously Ruby Adept has no connection to Augmentation. That's the one just for Preservation and Devastation. So how do you intend to design these hero talents so that they don't become just the default pick?
Chrono Warden Scale Commander will have a tuning package of X, Y, and Z. If they do have support-oriented abilities and specs like Chrono Warden, that'll be considered part of their throughput. Ruby Adept will be focused largely not on support because, like you mentioned, it doesn't share with augmentation. And going back to, I think Will's mentioned previously, the fact that these are chunks of talents and they're guaranteed gives us a lot of opportunities to make sure that across the board, they're as close as they can be in terms of performance.
Going back to interdimensional phase, now making hover a damage taken reduction, and just the overloading abilities and perhaps how they might change the rotation. Jericho had a really great question about what the intent is when it comes to the changing of your rotation with your hero talents and some of the unintended consequences of overloading some of these abilities.
Hopefully not to tread too much of the same ground over again. In the outline, of course, we talked about complexity and how we're in most hero talent trees, we're not necessarily adding new buttons. I'm a big fan, and I mean, I picked up on Devastation Evoker. I'm a big fan of keeping buttons to a minimum in sort of current WoW, and some specs keep maintaining that fantasy of having a million things going on. Some keep it simple. I love that there's a distinction. To me, one thing I'm mindful of is when an ability has been kind of overloaded with too much functionality at the end of the day. So especially when those things have different purposes. On one hand, so I'm looking at Temporal Burst in this tree, and to me that's wow, awesome. Like I'm taking Tip the Scales, this pretty mundane, quick thing that I push and kind of forget about after, and I'm giving it this really cool fresh coat of paint. And I think that's a great fantasy there. On the other hand, I look at interdimensional phase here, this warp damage taken reduction, and I think, wow, that's strong, right? And I like active mitigation buttons that require timing. I think that stuff's great. But wait a second, right? Am I going to have to now save hover charges just for that big hit that the boss does? And am I going to only be able to use hover in that way? How is that actually going to translate to gameplay? So is this dilemma of mine sort of an intended aspect of the design? And sort of how do you guys evaluate, whether an ability is kind of doing too much at the end of the day?
It's a great question, and honestly one we talk about all the time. The impression I'm getting based off what you just mentioned is that maybe we swung a little bit too hard with how much DR interdimensional phase gives you. Really, these should be nice bonuses to your abilities. They really shouldn't be changing how you sort of treat them mentally. We don't want you to sort of have those mental calculations constantly, unless it's something like a starting node or a capper node on these hero talent trees. They really shouldn't be changing the expectation of what a button does fundamentally. So really appreciate you letting us know that.
I think so. Because to me, hover is a very integral part of how the game plays for Evoker, and I think to other specs, how they sort of handle similar buttons, they're usually a little lower in potency, and they're usually on buttons like Fade or Feign Death that just don't actually do anything otherwise, right? So that's kind of the comparison that I'm drawing, I think, on that one.
Gotcha.
So
yeah, I mean,
great answer. Yeah,
good feedback. And asterisk to everything that you're going to see with these Hero Talents articles is tuning is not final. You'll notice that a lot of numbers are omitted on purpose. Numbers are really important for us, but we are also very much looking for, like, all right, hover gives me a DR. I'm not sure how I feel about that. That's really important feedback too. In terms of how we evaluate if something feels like it's too much, maybe, there's a lot of things that we do. I narrowed down to two sort of big things. Biggest one is feedback, both internally amongst ourselves and feedback from the community, which is what we're really sort of trying to get out of this push for hero talent articles. It's also playtesting. Feedback is awesome, but playtesting really also goes sort of a long way when it comes to figuring out what feels good and what feels bad.
So from this answer, we can glean that a lot of what we're seeing is subject to change, and they're going to be looking really closely at player feedback and playtesting to figure out where these talents are going to end up landing and what makes sense. Moving on to the reverberation side, we have a talent that just gives us 30% more damage on our upheaval and 30% more healing on Spirit Bloom, both does heal over time over 8 seconds. Going down from there, we have Primacy, which gives us a haste buff depending on how many targets have our upheaval debuff or Spirit Bloom hot. And then we have Instability Matrix, which makes it so every time you cast an Empower spell, you have a chance to reduce its cooldown by up to 15 seconds. So on average, this is going to be about 7 seconds less of cooldown on your empowered abilities, which is really big. It may not seem like a lot, but this is actually a fairly high throughput talent. Moving down from there, we have the capstone talent for Chrono Warden, which is After Image. Empower spell, send up to 3 Chrono Flames to your targets. Chrono Flames have a small chance to grant you Essence Burst. So essentially, this is just making your empowered abilities send out the first talent that we had in the top of the tree. We're going to be sending out 3 of those whenever we use our empower spells. And now we're also making it so that our Chrono Flames are going to have a small chance to give us Essence Burst. So this is going to make our Empower grant us Essence Burst. This is also going to make it so that we just get more Essence Burst from our Living Flames as well. So when it comes to my overall thoughts on the system, I'm very excited by it. I think it has a lot of potential to add some freshness to each specialization and customization too. Definitely looking forward to it. I am a little worried that some of these traits might just be so good that they become the default, but obviously that's going to come down to player feedback and balance. One of the things we discussed was having stuff like being able to buff 4 prescience and having your Ebon Mites go on your preferred targets. That deterministic feature, having that be only part of Chrono Warden wouldn't be great. So we asked, like, is this something that would be part of the hero talents, or would it be more on the class side of things?
So Prescience on Live is both a damage buff for your allies and is also sort of this main mechanism by which Augmentation selects buff targets, right? So we have this node here called Golden Opportunity where Prescience has a chance to not incur a cooldown. And this has very interesting implications for different players, for, more casual or, I describe it in my write-ups as autopilot gamers who just kind of use the default targeting to send their abilities. They might just see that as, hey, look, I get more presciences out, great, awesome. But for the more competitive-minded players, there's a lot of what I describe as spreadsheet gaming, where they might want to be, plotting out their prescience casts by the second, and adding this random element suddenly to prescience actually seems like it might have a very disruptive aspect to it, especially to the buff targeting minigame, where, I generally only want 4 prescience out because that's the only people I want to hit with my Ebon Mite. If I have more than that, who knows what happens. The question I really wanted to kind of draw out is, maybe if we can expect to see any changes to the way that buff targeting is addressed to sort of, open the door for maybe more possibilities here. But I'll leave the sort of answer up to you guys, I think.
Sure. Currently, there are no planned changes for buff targeting for things like Ebon Mite. If there are, they're not things that we're going to make on a hero talent level. There are things that we're going to make fundamentally on the class or spec. Personally, I think a prescience reset is kind of cool. Like, I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for things like anachronism procs. That being said, I also really like casino style
Sure.
gameplay where you just get resets. That's really fun to me. So I'm a little bit biased in that regard.
So I could go for that personally. Like I'm with you. That style needs to be competitive, I think, with the spreadsheet style is kind of the thing. So maybe it's just a tuning angle.
It's also mentioning that it's on a choice node. So if you don't really like that kind of gameplay, you could also pick, Master of Destiny instead, which is more cut and dry.
That's good, because it means that the gameplay where you want to have 4 prescience out all the time isn't locked behind one specific hero talent flavor, right? You don't have to be a Chrono Warden to have your prescience, I'm assuming, all 4 of them mapped out the whole time, if it were up to the class talents instead of the hero talents. All right, and that about does it for our hero talents preview and our interview with the devs. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it over to the end of our interview so you can see how we wrap things up. But before I go, if you like this video and you made it here to the end, please give this video a thumbs up and be sure to click that subscribe button and then ring the notification bell. And that way you'll be notified whenever I come out with new videos. Also, another big thank you to George and Jade for taking the time and giving us these great answers to these questions that we had. And another big thank you to Blizzard for the opportunity. This was really cool. So let's get back to the end of the interview. Appreciate your answers. These were great. And looking forward to getting our hands on it and giving you some more feedback. Any questions for us before we go?
I have no questions. I did just want to add, I think we've said it a couple times throughout the interview, one of the reasons why we're doing this so early is we're really interested in player feedback, right? So our hope here is that, once these go live, we'll get a lot of feedback, and, we consume this on a lot of different mediums, right? Like our forums, Discord, Reddit, anywhere that they, YouTube videos, George loves TikTok. I've said that now a couple times. So even if you give us a TikTok video, we'll look at it. generally
cheaper.
written yeah, generally written feedback is best for us. It's just easier to parse through. But again, like anywhere we can get this feedback is great. So please, please, please send us that feedback. We want to hear what you think about hero talents. Things we're specifically looking for are, how do you feel about the fantasies of the trees? Do the talents embody that fantasy? What are your thoughts on how the talents play, or they impact your rotation? I know that can be hard when you're just looking at a paper design, but even early thoughts on that is great. And we're really pushing to get the majority of these in to be play testable for our very first public testing in the future. Lastly, feedback. Even how once we get to that stage, like what the visual looks like, how the names are, is that coming across in the fantasy of these hero talents? So, please,
Okay.
please. I said please a lot already, but can't wait to hear feedback on this.
Jade basically saw everything I was going to say. Thanks, Jade.
Sweet.
Two things I wanted to add. This is just the beginning. This is our first wave. We're going to be doing more of these on the sort of road to public testing. So look forward to them. They're going to be a lot of fun. And honestly, if you're around for Dragonflight Alpha, where we did sort of our talent previews, similar sort of vibe to that. And yeah, if you make a TikTok for Chrono Warden, I'm going to send it to like everyone I know, because that's apparently what is my preferred method of feedback, Jade. But forums are great too. So yeah, I really appreciate the time.
All right, noted. Send all TikToks to George. Got it.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right, appreciate y'all. Yeah, this was great. Had a lot of fun and really excited for